Ladies and gentlemen, there is a kind of silence that is not empty, not broken, and not passive. It is the silence that arrives after pain. It is the silence that is born when a heart has been pushed too far, when a soul has given too much, and when a mind has finally understood what words could never fix. This is the silence that people never see coming. This is the silence that does not scream, does not beg, does not argue, and does not chase. This is the silence that begins the destruction of illusions. This is the silence that ruins false power. This is the silence that forces people to meet the truth they spent so long avoiding. You see, most people believe power is loud. They think power is the person who talks the most, dominates the room, wins the argument, gets the last word, and makes the biggest scene. But the deeper truth is far more unsettling. Real power is often quiet. Real power does not need attention. Real power does not need to perform. Real power can stand still, can breathe calmly, can observe everything, and can say nothing at all. And in that silence, something extraordinary begins to happen. The people who once believed they controlled your emotions suddenly realize they have lost access to your reaction. The people who fed on your explanations suddenly discover that you no longer offer them the fuel. The people who confused your kindness for weakness suddenly feel the cold weight of your absence. That is the beginning of their collapse. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl Jung understood something that many people still fail to understand today. The outer world is often a reflection of the inner world. What you tolerate outside of yourself often reveals what remains unsettled inside of you. What you keep entertaining in the name of love, loyalty, patience, or peace can become the very thing that drains your soul. And there comes a moment when the psyche, the deeper self, decides it can no longer continue the performance. It withdraws. It grows quiet. It stops trying to rescue people who never intended to change. It stops explaining itself to people who were never listening in the first place. And this withdrawal is not defeat. It is the beginning of awareness. Because silence, when it is chosen with dignity, becomes a mirror, and most people cannot bear to look into that mirror. They expected noise. They expected emotion. They expected you to react the same way you always did. They expected tears. They expected anger. They expected one more message, one more attempt, one more explanation, one more chance for them to twist your feelings and keep you attached. They expected your pain to make you predictable. They expected your love to make you available forever. They expected your loyalty to keep you within reach, no matter how much they took from you. They expected that you would keep giving, keep forgiving, keep waiting, and keep opening the door even when they had already walked out of your life in every way that mattered. But then you became silent and everything changed, not because your silence was weak, but because it was precise, not because you had nothing left to say, but because you finally understood that not everything deserves a response, not because you lost interest in life, but because you lost interest in feeding what was destroying your peace. Your silence was not an accident. It was a decision. It was the moment your spirit stopped negotiating with chaos. It was the moment you withdrew your energy from people who had made a habit of taking it for granted. And that withdrawal hit them harder than any argument ever could. People do not always fear anger. They often know how to survive anger. They know how to argue back, how to justify themselves, how to blame you, how to play the victim, how to turn your emotions against you. But silence is different. Silence is not reactive. Silence is not easy to manipulate. Silence does not give them a script. Silence does not feed their drama. Silence leaves them alone with their own conscience. And that is where their fear begins. Because once your silence arrives, they can no longer measure your pain by your words. They can no longer use your reactions as proof that they still matter. They can no longer feel secure in the idea that they still control your inner world. Your silence says something that no speech can say with the same force. You no longer have access to me in the way you once did. And that sentence, even when unspoken, can destroy the illusion of power in the minds of people who depended on your response to feel important. Think about it. For a long time. Maybe they expected you to explain every feeling. They expected you to justify every boundary. They expected you to soften every truth so they would not feel uncomfortable. They expected you to return after every wound, to reopen the door after every disappointment, to act as though betrayal was just a misunderstanding, to pretend that neglect was temporary, and to keep calling it love even when your soul was slowly being emptied. They were comfortable because you kept making them comfortable. They were confident because you kept giving them access. They were careless because they believed your heart would never fully turn away. But silence does what anger never could. Silence ends the performance. Silence says, I have seen enough. Silence snorts, says I no longer need to prove my worth. Silence says I am not here to chase what should have protected me. Silence says you cannot harm what I no longer hand to you. Silence says your opinion is not my identity. Silence says my peace is more valuable than your approval. And when a person reaches that point, they become dangerous to the systems that once controlled them. That is why your silence destroys them, not because you destroy them in a cruel or vengeful way, but because you dissolve the fantasy they were living inside. They wanted your attention because your attention validated them. They wanted your emotional chaos because it made them feel significant. They wanted your replies because your replies kept the connection alive, even if the connection was unhealthy. They wanted your presence, not necessarily because they valued you, but because they valued what you gave them. And once you stop giving it, they must confront something they were never prepared to face, the emptiness of their own position. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a tragic truth in human nature. Many people do not love others as much as they love being needed. They do not seek connection. They seek control. They do not seek intimacy. They seek admiration. They do not seek understanding. They seek access. And when you are a kind, thoughtful, emotionally generous person, you become a perfect place for such people to settle. They build themselves inside your patience. They grow attached to your forgiveness. They become comfortable in your empathy. And over time, they begin to mistake your softness for surrender. But the moment you become silent, they feel the ground shift under their feet. Because silence is where your soul begins to recover its borders. It is in silence that you hear what pain has been trying to tell you. It is in silence that you notice how much of your energy was being spent on people who never invested the same in return. It is in silence that you see how much of your identity was shaped by the hope that they would one day change. It is in silence that you realize some people were never afraid of losing you because they assumed you would never truly leave. It is in silence that the truth finally becomes audible. And the truth is rarely gentle. The truth may tell you that you begged too long. The truth may tell you that you tolerated too much. The truth may tell you that you explained yourself to those who had already decided not to understand. The truth may tell you that you gave access to your heart before people had earned it. The truth may tell you that what you called loyalty was often just endurance. The truth may tell you that your silence is not late, it is timely. The truth may tell you that every boundary you failed to place became a doorway for disrespect. The truth may tell you that your healing begins when your expectations finally stop feeding disappointment. This is the part they never expected. They expected you to stay emotionally available while they remained emotionally absent. They expected you to keep reaching out while they kept pulling away. They expected you to continue being warm while they stayed cold. They expected you to remain a source of comfort even after they became a source of confusion. They expected the old version of you, the one who explained, defended, and tried to save everything. They did not expect the new version of you, the version that no longer needed their permission to be at peace. That new version is not loud, but it is powerful. That new version is not bitter, but it is clear. That new version is not cruel, but it is no longer available for nonsense. That new version does not destroy out of hatred, it destroys illusions through clarity, and clarity is far more painful than anger. Anger can be dismissed as emotion. Silence cannot. Anger can be labeled as overreaction. Silence cannot. Anger can be argued with. Silence cannot. Silence leaves people with themselves, and that is where the real damage begins. Carl Jung often pointed toward the importance of confronting the shadow. The hidden parts of the self, the truths we prefer not to see, the wounds we bury, and the patterns we repeat until they become our prison. Many people live their entire lives without doing this inner work. They keep projecting, blaming, controlling, and demanding because they cannot bear their own emptiness. They use other people as mirrors, so they never have to look inward. They demand emotional noise because silence would force them into self-awareness. And that is precisely why your silence unsettles them. Your silence creates the conditions where projection no longer works. They can no longer dump their confusion onto you and call it a relationship. They can no longer hide behind your reaction and pretend they are innocent. They can no longer escape the consequences of their behavior just because you used to be willing to absorb them. Silence is not a lack of response. Silence is a response with depth. It tells people that access must be earned. It tells people that love is not endless tolerance. It tells people that your peace cannot be bargained away. It tells people that the version of you they took for granted no longer exists in the same form. It tells people that the door they kept assuming was open has quietly closed. And here is what makes silence so devastating to the wrong people. They cannot control what they can no longer provoke. As long as you argued, they could steer you. As long as you cried, they could pity themselves. As long as you pleaded, they could stay superior. As long as you reacted, they could remain central. But once you became silent, you removed their stage. Now they are left with an audience of one themselves. That is why people panic when your silence arrives. They begin to send messages they never sent before. They begin to check on you in ways they never did when you were hurting. They begin to ask questions they should have asked long ago. They begin to feel the weight of your absence because your silence has made your presence impossible to ignore. They realize often too late that what they thought was endless availability was actually patience. What they thought was permission was actually mercy. What they thought was weakness was actually restraint. And restraint, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the highest forms of strength, because it takes strength to remain calm when you have every reason to explode. It takes strength to remain silent when you have every reason to explain. It takes strength to walk away when your heart still remembers the good moments. It takes strength to stop feeding what has been feeding on you. It takes strength to accept that some people will only appreciate you once they can no longer use you. This is why your silence is so powerful. It is not that you vanished, it is that you became unavailable to destruction. You stopped volunteering your spirit for the emotional survival of people who had no intention of respecting it. You stopped carrying relationships on your back while others stood around calling it mutual. You stopped performing for people who only loved the version of you that kept them comfortable. Your silence is the sound of your nervous system finally saying enough. It is the sound of your heart finally saying, I deserve better. It is the sound of your soul finally saying, I choose myself. And when that happens, the old world around you begins to crack. Some will call you cold, some will call you distant, some will call you changed, some will call you difficult. Some will say you are not the same person anymore, and they will be correct. You are not the same person anymore. You are the person who has learned that every explanation is not owed. You are the person who has learned that every apology is not sincere. You are the person who has learned that every connection is not destiny. You are the person who has learned that not everyone who enters your life is meant to remain there. You are the person who has learned that peace must be protected, not just desired. You are the person who has learned that silence can be the final lesson. There is a profound dignity in this. There is a sacredness in refusing to chase what keeps hurting you. There is wisdom in allowing your absence to speak where your presence was ignored. There is mastery in becoming still enough to see clearly. When you become silent in the right way, you stop living as a reaction and start living as a choice. And that choice is what terrifies people who depended on your lack of boundaries, because your silence means they no longer get to define the meaning of your life. Your silence means they no longer get to decide how much you are worth. Your silence means they no longer get to use your compassion as a weakness. Your silence means they no longer get to rewrite your reality while you stand there and accept it. Your silence means the game is over, and that is why it destroys them. Not because you are cruel, not because you are vindictive, not because you want revenge, but because your silence exposes what their noise was hiding. It exposes insecurity. It exposes manipulation. It exposes entitlement. It exposes emotional laziness. It exposes their dependence on your reaction. It exposes the fragility of the image they built around themselves. When a person has no inner stability, they need external chaos to feel alive. They need the drama. They need the conflict. They need the chase. They need the push and pull because it keeps them from confronting their own emptiness. Your silence removes the turbulence, and when the turbulence ends, they begin to sink into their own unresolved self. This is the unseen power of withdrawal. Not petty withdrawal, not manipulative withdrawal, but conscious withdrawal. The kind that says, I will no longer participate in my own diminishment. The kind that says, I refuse to keep proving what should be obvious. The kind that says, I am done confusing endurance with love. The kind that says, I no longer need to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding me. The kind that says, my life is not a courtroom, and I am not here to keep defending my existence. That is a holy kind of silence. It can be lonely at first, yes it can, because every transformation carries grief. You do not become silent without first mourning the version of yourself who kept hoping. You do not become silent without first grieving what you wished people would become. You do not become silent without first accepting that some relationships are not broken by accidents, but by patterns. And patterns once seen clearly can no longer be unseen. That awareness changes you forever. But loneliness is not the same as emptiness. Loneliness can be the doorway to self-respect. Loneliness can be the space where your own voice returns. Loneliness can be the season where you stop outsourcing your worth. Loneliness can be the moment when your soul begins to remember itself. Do not fear the silence that helps you return to yourself. Fear the noise that kept you away from yourself. Fear the conversations that kept you confused. Fear snorts the promises that kept you waiting. Fear the relationships that only felt alive when you were suffering. Fear the version of connection that requires you to shrink. Fear the environments where your boundaries are treated like betrayal. Fear the people who only value you when you are available for their convenience. Your silence is not the end of your story. It is the correction of your story. It is the point where you stop being written by other people's expectations. It is the point where you stop auditioning for love. It is the point where you stop negotiating your dignity. It is the point where you reclaim your mind from constant emotional invasion. It is the point where you realize your absence can teach what your presence could not. And sometimes absence is the only lesson people will ever understand. They do not understand compassion until it leaves. They do not understand loyalty until it stops. They do not understand care until it no longer arrives automatically. They do not understand your value until the supply is gone. They do not understand your silence until they feel the echo of what they lost. That echo is what haunts them. Not because you are trying to haunt them, but because the truth has a way of lingering when it was ignored for too long. They remember your patience. They remember your warmth. They remember how easy it was to take more than they gave. They remember how you made excuses for them. They remember how you softened your own pain so they would not feel too guilty. They remember how you protected the bond even when it was already hurting you. And now, in the face of your silence, those memories become unbearable because they revealed something they cannot escape. They were loved in a way they did not deserve. That realization can break a person or it can awaken them. But either way, it changes them. And change begins where control ends. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in every life when you must decide whether you will remain a wound that others can keep touching, or whether you will become a healed boundary that refuses further injury. There comes a moment when your soul asks you to stop being understandable to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. There comes a moment when your heart asks you to stop offering access to those who only know how to take. There comes a moment when your mind asks you to stop calling confusion destiny. There comes a moment when your silence becomes the most truthful thing about you. That is the moment of transformation, not when you convince them, not when you win the argument, not when they finally admit what they did, not when they come back with apologies, not when they cry, not when they feel sorry. The transformation begins the moment you no longer need any of it. Because the deepest freedom is not in changing other people. It is in no longer being controlled by their inability to change. This is why the strong become quiet. This is why the healed become selective. This is why the wise become difficult to manipulate. This is why the self-respecting become unreadable to the old dynamics. This is why silence can be more frightening than rage. Rage still belongs to the old story. Silence belongs to the new one. Rage says you hurt me. Silence says you no longer have that power. Rage demands attention. Silence withdraws it. Rage burns quickly. Silence lasts. Rage exhausts the body. Silence restores the soul. And in the end, what destroys them is not that you became cruel, but that you became clear. Clear about what you will accept. Clear about what you will no longer chase. Clear about who deserves access. Clear about what love actually looks like. Clear about the difference between being wanted and being valued. Clear about the difference between being needed and being respected. Clear about the difference between being tolerated and being cherished. Once that clarity arrives, there is no return to blindness. So let them be shocked. Let them be confused. Let them wonder why you do not answer the same way. Let them ask why you are no longer available. Let them feel the emptiness where your constant response used to be. Let them face the silence they created by refusing to honor your voice. Because your silence is not punishment, it is consequence. It is the consequence of being ignored too many times. It is the consequence of being taken for granted too long. It is the consequence of realizing that peace is more precious than persuasion. It is the consequence of choosing yourself after everyone else has already chosen convenience. And if they are destroyed by that silence, then perhaps what was destroyed was never genuine to begin with. Perhaps what was destroyed was their illusion, their entitlement, their access, their fantasy of control. Perhaps what was destroyed was the version of you they believed would always remain available. Perhaps what was destroyed was the false story they told themselves about your limits, your heart, and your endurance. That story is over now. A new one has begun. In this new story, you do not beg to be understood. You do not chase what keeps leaving. You do not explain yourself endlessly. You do not mistake temporary attention for devotion. You do not confuse familiarity with loyalty. You do not surrender your peace to make others comfortable. You do not return to what required your disappearance to notice your worth. In this new story, silence is not emptiness. It is authority. It is the authority of a person who has seen through illusion. It is the authority of a person who has stopped handing out access to emotional thieves. It is the authority of a person who no longer confuses attachment with love. It is the authority of a person who has learned that dignity sometimes speaks best when it says nothing at all. So stand in that silence. Let it teach you. Let it cleanse you. Let it strengthen you. Let it expose what was hidden. Let it break what was false. Let it return you to yourself. And when they ask why you changed, you do not need a speech longer than your peace. You do not need to defend the growth that cost you so much. You do not need to reopen wounds just to make other people comfortable with your healing. You only need to remain calm, remain clear, remain whole, because the silence that destroyed them was never really about them at all. It was about you. It was about your awakening. It was about your boundary. It was about your return. It was about the moment you stopped being a source for their comfort and started becoming a protector of your own soul. Ladies and gentlemen, the world changes when a person learns to be silent for the right reasons. Not because they have nothing left, but because they finally understand what matters. Not because they are broken, but because they are no longer willing to let broken things define their life. Not because they are weak, but because they have discovered a strength that does not need applause. And that is the strength that changes everything. That is the silence that reveals truth. That is the silence that restores dignity. That is the silence that ends manipulation. That is the silence that forces reality to speak. That is the silence that destroys the illusion of control. They never expected it. They never saw it coming. They never believed your quiet could become your power, but it did. And now they must live with the echo of everything they lost when they underestimated your silence. Thank you. Thank